From DLA Piper, this is the U.S. Latin America Panorama podcast. This podcast series focuses on the latest developments across the Americas and globally, highlighting business, legal, economic, and political developments affecting businesses daily. This episode features DLA Piper's Francisco Cerezo, partner and chair of the U.S. Latin America practice, and Ignacio Sanchez, partner and chair of the Geopolitical risk team, discussing Latin America's strategic opportunity in the new trade era.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another edition of Panoramic Podcast, where we cover current affairs of interest to our friends and clients around the globe. We always try to have a focus primarily on Latin America, but really on Latin America's connectivity to the rest of the world. This year has been obviously very interesting, with everything from tariff volatility to a series of other issues, regulatory issues, supply chain issues. But it all really comes down and falls under, let's call it a category of geopolitical risk. And we've seen since early in 2025 how the issue of geopolitical risk has been front and center across investment decisions, strategic decisions that our clients are making around the globe, not only in Latin America, as far-flung as Asia, and it has an impact on Latin America. So as we wind down the year, this will be our last Panorama podcast of 2025. I couldn't think of anyone better than my friend and partner, Ignacio Sanchez, who many of you know as Iggy. Just as a quick intro, Ignacio is a senior partner in our Washington, D.C. office. The reason we're excited to have him, he's also the senior partner who heads our geopolitical risk practice, and he has a really broad view on everything from sanctions to tariffs, compliance globally. And more than just focus on the U.S., he really ties all of the pieces together, whether we're talking Africa, Asia, the U.S., Canada, Latin America. I've had the privilege of collaborating with him on a number of fronts with clients, and actually sat with clients everywhere from Asia to Latin America, U.S., Canada. And his thought leadership on this is really second to none. So with that said, as a preamble, Ignacio, Iggy, thank you very much for joining us today. I really look forward to having this conversation with you.
Well, thanks for inviting me. Like you said, it's a very interesting time. Those of us who've been practicing as long as you and I have, I don't think we have seen this kind of dynamic before. And our clients are having to navigate really choppy waters. So let's get on with it and see how we can help them.
Super. So you spend a great deal of time essentially as a boardroom advisor, if you will, sitting with boards, with the seniors, C-suite level and CLOs globally, and then also with governments, because I know part of your practice is also advising sovereigns on all sorts of geopolitical risks from a Washington, D.C. perspective. Obviously, you're based in D.C., but as how it impacts them globally. So let's just start to set the table, and then we'll get more granular as we continue the conversation. But in 2024, these conversations were not as top of mind. They've always been relevant, and there's always been a need to have these conversations that fall under the category of geopolitical risk, whether it was during the Biden administration, during the first Trump administration, and before. There's always been a need, and these have been important conversations in the business community with our clients globally. But 2025 really took it to a different level, primarily driven in part through the tariff volatility or whatnot. So just what feels fundamentally different compared to 5 or 10 years ago? Maybe you could set the table that way.
Sure. Like you said, I think the geopolitical risk issues have been here. We have been navigating them. They have been evolving. Our clients may not have felt it or seen it so dramatically as we have with the onset of the second Trump administration. As we've advised a lot of folks, there is a broad arc of policy that has been developing on these issues, and that arc continues, and it will continue beyond the second term of Donald Trump. What Donald Trump did was, as we were telling clients, we thought this arc would continue no matter who got elected president, but he has a different tone and a different speed at which he insisted on doing these things. And I think that is what was the catalyst for everybody saying, oh my God, this is happening. Yet for many of us who are advising clients, we have been saying this is going to be coming. This is the evolution of a broader arc of policy development that has been taking place, in large part driven by the shift from a global trade and investment regime that was led by the United States that advocated for full and open trade and investment to what I will call a fractionalized global economy and trading system, where maybe we are ending up in a bipolar system with one camp, the United States, and in the other camp, China. And it is that competition that is driving a lot of this. That competition and this broader arc will continue, but it certainly brought everything together very quickly when the president signed his America First trade policy the day he got sworn in, and then a month later, the America First investment policy. And those are the two pillars. Anybody who is surprised by this just didn't read what the president put out the day he got sworn in.
Quick question on that as a follow-up, just for the benefit of our audience. If you could give our listeners or viewers a sense of what is in each of those two documents, that would be helpful.
Sure. Like I said, the president gets sworn in, has the parade, walks into the White House and signs the America First trade policy. So this had been prepared. He was predicting it throughout the campaign, and it was signed immediately upon walking into the Oval Office. That is an aggressive document. It is a document that talks about how the global trade system had been taken advantage of by other countries to the detriment of the United States. In essence, that's the underlying theme of that document. And he orders all of the agencies in his government to give him recommendations as to how to correct it by April 1. And a few weeks later says, and I want, as part of those recommendations, what tariffs we should impose. So if the first you heard about this was April 2nd, you weren't following what was coming out of the White House day one. So very aggressive, somewhat antagonistic to all of our trading partners around the world. The America First investment policy the next month comes in a different form. It is very inviting. We want you to invest in the United States. This is a big deal. You are welcome. The language of it even speaks in terms of the beautiful sovereign wealth funds from our allies. That terminology was very inviting for foreign direct investment in the United States, accelerating approvals and permits and things for the investments. With one caveat. The caveat was the receptivity to your investment in the United States depended upon the separation from China that you had. So the more entangled you were with China, the less receptive the investor would be for investment in the United States.
So interesting, because I've had the opportunity to be with you in some of these meetings with our clients globally. And as part of setting the table, you also describe how this arc, as you well describe, really actually goes back well before Trump, putting aside perhaps the tone and some of the substance of how Trump has executed on this. But if we could rewind a little bit, because I've heard your thought leadership on this, whether it was when we were in Korea and you were speaking to a group of businessmen, of how really when you look back, you could actually go back several administrations, including Democratic and other Republican administrations, and the basis was already being set. So maybe if you could speak to that before we move on and start getting a little bit more granular.
Yeah, I think the first big sign of this was during George W. Bush's administration. You will remember at one point, Dubai Ports World took place. Dubai Ports was trying to buy Peninsula and Oriental. There were 7 ports that were operated by Peninsula and Oriental on the east coast of the United States. And a big debate broke out about should we trust them as an investor in the United States. We had a law that is administered by the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS, which reviews inbound investments for national security concerns. And as a result of that transaction, which ultimately did not go forward, the law was modified and it was significantly tightened to superimpose very significant national security concerns on the national security review. There was another transaction at the same time. CNOOC tried to buy Unical, and that was disallowed by virtue of the CFIUS law. But the law was modified, and that was the first big sign that we're imposing a national security overlay on what had normally been our policy of welcoming foreign direct investment into the United States. That continued to evolve. CFIUS has continued to evolve in every administration. It has been tightened either by regulation or legislation in every administration since George W. Bush. And we have seen other examples where we have then started to impose sanctions or other trade restrictions on the trade side, not just on the investment side. So we started to see how we started to impose export restrictions on exports that were going to China in various different industries that we have a significant concern. We started to list Chinese companies that were then prohibited from receiving investments from the United States. And now we have also had numerous executive orders by Trump, by Biden, by Trump as well, that started to impose more restrictions related to exports or investments, particularly related to China. But then we also saw a significant flurry of activity against Russia as well. And we've seen some further tightening of restrictions with respect to Venezuela. So it has been a broader arc. But the broad arc, in my view, is really driven in large part by the U.S.-China dynamic. And that has continued, and I believe will continue no matter who is elected president next.
So, I mean, that begs then the question, and before we start getting more granular on Latin America, I would love your thoughts. It almost seems as if we're moving towards a world where countries are expected to choose a side, right? So if you could speak to that, and Latin America, which certainly for historic reasons, proximity and whatnot, has the deepest ties with the U.S. of any of the global players, but certainly China has had an increasingly important role in Latin America. So if you could speak to that first question of, are people then now or governments expected to choose a side? And then as we start moving to Latin America, I mean, how do you think Latin America, how realistic is it that Latin American countries are able to position themselves and navigate that bipolar, if you will, positioning?
Sure. So I think we should split what governments will do from what companies will do. Because I think a country will probably try to stay as neutral as they can for the benefit of their citizens who are potentially engaged in commerce with both major economic players on the global scale, the United States and China. So to the extent that they can keep from picking a side as long as possible, I'm sure that everybody will try to do that. If you're managing a business, however, you have to be thinking in terms of, okay, what is my business going to look like in the next year, the next 3 years, the next 5 years, the next 10 years? And therein lies a difference between what a government might do and what a company might do, because the company may start to look at these restrictions as, well, it may force me in one direction or another, depending on what their strategic plan is. And at the same time, potentially create opportunities based upon how the dynamic develops between these two big blocks that may develop over time. So I could see companies who might, for business reasons, pick a focus on one particular block, even if their president, their prime minister, whatever, might try to remain as neutral as long as possible.
So I want to start talking tariffs and what that means and whatnot. But before that, let's take one step back also. You're in D.C. It's sometimes an overused word of Washington insider, but you certainly are. And you know a lot of people in D.C. and you've been in D.C. for a long time. For our friends in Latin America, especially as you see that in Latin America, there's these different paradigm shifts in which you have certain countries really more with a leftist slant, some with more of a conservative right-wing slant. We just saw the elections in Chile, that a very conservative or right-wing, however you want to call it, government was just elected yesterday. So in light of all this realignment you're seeing in Latin America, I'd love your thoughts on that. But I mean, much has been said about how in 2000 and maybe even in years before that, how Latin America's moment vis-a-vis the U.S. was going to happen. It had more of a protagonistic role in terms of U.S. foreign relations. And then 9/11 happened, right? A lot of it's been written about that. And then all of a sudden, it was all about Iraq, Afghanistan, and Latin America just really went into the back burner for certain. And there's been all sorts of different things over the years which have perhaps kept Latin America to be as protagonistic, if you will, in terms of priorities of U.S. foreign policy. So can you speak to how, at least today, you think in Washington, D.C., its view of Latin America, its importance, its relevance, if some countries are more than others, and who's driving that conversation in D.C. from an administration perspective?
Sure. As you said, I think in George W. Bush's administration, I was part of the transition team for the Treasury Department and the U.S. Trade Representative's Office. I know there was a significant desire to have a focus in Latin America. His brother was the governor of Florida. For obvious reasons, Latin America and Florida relationship is extremely important from an economic perspective, as well as for Texas. So you had a president who was a southern state governor, and his brother is the governor of Florida. You could see why a focus on Latin America would develop. But I agree with you, 9/11 derailed all of that, and we haven't seen, I don't think, a focus on Latin America as much until now. And I think Ronald Reagan's head of presidential personnel coined the phrase that personnel is policy. And I think that is particularly the case today. You have the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who is also the National Security Advisor. Marco Rubio not only is in those two roles now, he was Speaker of the House in Florida. He was a senator for the state of Florida. When he came to the Senate, he was a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the Senate Intelligence Committee. He rose to be the senior-most member of the Intelligence Committee, but he was also the second highest ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He chaired the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee. And I believe that there were opportunities for him to move to other committees, and he refused to move to other committees because he refused to leave the chair of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee because of his personal interest and commitment to Latin America. I think he envisions a very strong role for the United States in Latin America. I think he would like to see a very close tie between the United States and Latin America. And part of that is driven from his own political beliefs, but also from a national security perspective, because the vacuum that was created by the U.S.'s perhaps non-involvement in Latin America and American businesses not being engaged in Latin America has been filled by the Chinese. So now not only is there this interest in the region, you and I remember we were going to have the free trade area of the Americas. We were going to take NAFTA and make it hemispheric. That all fell by the wayside, and China has come into the hemisphere in a very strong way. And I think that Secretary of State Rubio, National Security Advisor Rubio, both hats, but most importantly, as National Security Advisor, he sits outside the Oval Office. I think he intends for there to be a strong assertion of American policy and economic and political influence in the hemisphere.
So that's a perfect segue. Tariffs, trade policy, however we want to characterize it, has been front page news for the good part of 2025. So let's start getting a little bit more granular on that. So we know that tariffs, export controls, or industrial policy, if you will, are really now central to U.S. policymaking. So you deal with a lot of policy issues on a daily basis. From a policy standpoint, how should Latin Americans think about this shift? Again, as we've mentioned earlier, this was not as central to necessarily prior administrations, whether they were Republican or Democrats, or even indeed under the prior Trump administration. So with this more pronounced shift, if you will, how do you think Latin America, both on the business sector as well as even from the sovereign sector, how they should think about this shift?
I think they need to be very nimble, and I think they need to be looking for the signs of things as they have developed. The April 2nd tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs, as the president called them when he announced them, whether they're constitutional or not, that's going to be determined in the next few months when the Supreme Court issues its ruling. I don't think the ruling is going to matter one way or the other in a significant way other than a temporary relief from the tariffs and potential some refunds of the tariffs already paid. Why do I say that? I think that we've seen the European Union and the UK enter into a deal with the United States on the tariff issue. We've seen Korea and Japan do the same. The president went to Southeast Asia and he cut deals with Vietnam, Indonesia, and other governments. So I don't think that those deals are going to fall apart by virtue of whatever the Supreme Court rules. Actually, what I think that those governments have achieved is a certainty and a stability as to what the number is on a going forward basis. And they have probably, whether they liked it or not, decided this is the best approach. Why? Because if the current tariffs are found unconstitutional and they don't have a deal with the United States, the president still has many other authorities to impose tariffs. He has the Section 232 and Sections 301 of the Tariff Acts that create powers for the president to target industries under the Section 232 or to target countries under Section 301. If you really look at those April 2nd tariffs, whether you like them or not, at least they are across the board, versus if that fails, and I'm not saying whether it should or shouldn't, I'm just saying if it does, there is, we understand, an effort prepared in the White House to be able to move quickly to 232 and 301 tariffs. If that happens, there's going to be a lot of winners and a lot of losers, as opposed to everything across the board. Companies need to be, I think that if the tariffs fail, a lot of companies say, hurrah, we now get these refunds or potentially get these refunds. But what if then your industry is targeted under Section 232, and now you went from 10 or 15% tariffs to potentially 40, 50, or 60% tariffs?
It's interesting. I remember a conversation a couple of months back in which we were both participating, and you were mentioning that beyond whether you're at 10% or 15% or 50% tariffs, that given country, how really you need to look beyond that and how all of these other unintended consequences, like when you sit there, whether you're a global conglomerate or perhaps even a smaller business, you need to look beyond just that percentage of all these other unintended consequences in the chessboard and think ahead well beyond whether the actual percentage of the tariff and where you invest. A lot of your investment decisions, do you then put a factory in one country versus another? How that could impact other aspects of your business beyond just that more narrow view of the dollar amount and 10% versus 50%. So can you speak a little bit about those unintended consequences and when you sit with your clients? And I want to hear your thoughts also on nearshoring.
Yep.
But I know you've sat with a number of clients and you walk them through. Initially, they're all about, do you think it's going to be 10% versus 25%? And what should we do about that? And then really it becomes a broader conversation. So maybe if you could speak a little bit to that, it'd be great.
Sure. As you said, this is not about any one issue, and tariffs has gotten a lot of attention. But the real geopolitical game is what about all of the further developments that could be taking place as this dynamic continues to develop between the United States and China. So I've seen everything from someone who will say, I'm going to move my supply chain or some of my manufacturing from China, and I may move it to Vietnam. And yes, the United States now has a deal with Vietnam, but let's play out another scenario, which is, I think, the one you're referring to, which is the most dramatic one. What if in a year or two, China decides that it's going to move on Taiwan, right? And now all of a sudden that goes from a small gap that is existing between the United States and China. There's a big breach now that gets created if that were happening, depending on the circumstances as to when it happens. But then it'll be, okay, where does the European Union land on that? Where does the UK land? Where does Korea and Japan land? And then if you moved your facility from China to Vietnam, where does Vietnam land? Is it going to align with China or is it going to align with the United States? And those are the kinds of things that the unintended consequences that you make a plan just on the basis of one issue, but you didn't look at the bigger picture and you didn't look out 2, 3, 5, 10 years to better analyze what the global dynamic might be like and what might or might not be your best choice. That leads us naturally into nearshoring and the importance of Latin America and the alignment that may exist, or at least the friendliness that may exist between the United States and some of the countries in Latin America. Obviously, Venezuela, that's a non-starter. You're not going to go move your manufacturing to Venezuela because we have sanctions. But it might be advantageous to move to Chile. It might be advantageous to move to Peru, the Central American countries, Mexico. In Korea, you talked about how well President Sheinbaum has manage the relationship with President Trump. And again, that might still be a very good and viable alternative. If you had told me 2 months ago Brazil, I would have been like, yeah, I'm not sure. Well, the dynamic was pretty dicey, but it looks like the dynamic between President Lula and President Trump is on an upward note. It's volatile. It could go south very quickly, but it could be Brazil that is a big beneficiary of this. India. Where does India land on these issues? India is a potential massive beneficiary of moving manufacturing out of China to India, but it's not nearshored. It's much nearer here in our own hemisphere. And I think that's where the policy of the administration is. The administration wants to bring as much manufacturing as it can back to the United States. But short of back in the United States, close to the United States is much better than further and more aligned with China.
We've talked about some of the jurisdictions that probably stand to gain a lot from that. And certainly in Central America, you have Costa Rica, you have Puerto Rico, which is obviously part of the U.S., obviously Mexico. So there's some jurisdictions, including Costa Rica, Puerto Rico, Mexico, that are certainly in, let's call it pole position, if you will, to take advantage of this trend.
And this is why I was saying that different businesses might react very differently than what a government might react. And that's really dependent upon their industry. If you have an industry that is very good in the textile industry, as Peru is, that may become a very good option for major American apparel companies. If it's pharma, it might be Puerto Rico, where there may be very significant advantages and a long history with the industry. If it's mining, it could be Argentina, Chile, and Peru. Forestry, Brazil and Chile, and the combinations are enormous, and it's really important for our clients in the region and outside of the region who are looking for other sources of supply to look at the Western Hemisphere as a very significant potential alternative to China.
So shifting gears a little bit, but still under our theme of the day of geopolitical risk, sanctions and enforcement as policy tools, if you will. From Washington, it's been using sanctions and other tools really as a way of shaping trade, financial opportunities for U.S. companies, market entry issues and whatnot. But there's one in particular, before I get your broader view on the use of sanctions, and you've been working with sanctions not only as to Latin America, but I know we've turned to you on issues related to Iran and other jurisdictions over the years. But there's one in particular that I think could be very interesting to our audience, and it's not yet on many people's radars. And if you could spend a few minutes describing this whole anti-terrorism, anti-cartel development this year under the Trump administration that focuses on drug cartels being designated as terrorists, what does that actually mean? I think there's a lot of compliance work that needs to go into that, just the same way that years ago, FCPA became something that companies needed to develop compliance programs to address what at the time began to be very aggressive enforcement by the U.S. Department of Justice as to potential FCPA, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, violations. This new policy on the anti-cartels terrorism, I don't know if that's an executive order. Maybe you could speak to that and explain to our audience what it actually is and then what that actually means for companies doing business not only in Mexico, but in other jurisdictions, and what they can do about it to be prepared for this wave of enforcement that many people think is coming.
Sure. Sanctions is a very powerful tool. In fact, to go back to the tariff issue, the big question before the Supreme Court is that the president used the International Emergency Economic Powers Act as the authority for imposing all of these tariffs. And that is the law that gives the president enormous powers with respect to sanctions. Not necessarily with respect to tariffs, which is why that was challenged legally as to whether that law was taken too far in trying to impose the tariffs. But when it comes to national security issues and what we normally see as regular sanctions, it is a very, very powerful tool. The president simply has to declare a national emergency. And when he declares the national emergency, he can take immediate measures to target persons, entities under that law and make them completely off limits to U.S. persons, U.S. financial institutions, U.S. insurers, U.S. writ large. The way those sanctions have been applied in the past is that, for instance, after 9/11, we started to designate, and we had before, different, I call them the bad actors around the world, the narco traffickers, the money launderers, the terrorists, the proliferators of weapons of mass destruction. There's all manner of different categories. But the most scary from a business perspective is when parties have been designated a foreign terrorist organization. And that includes Al-Qaeda and ISIS and all of these players. That is the same designation that has now been applied to the drug cartels in our hemisphere. They were already, many of them were sanctioned under other laws. There's law enforcement issues with respect to them, but now they are a foreign terrorist organization. So now the full breadth of U.S. sanctions applies. And not only is the U.S. freezing their accounts and trying to block any of their transactions, but it now puts any parties that inadvertently, but under the definition of knowingly, which seems incongruous here, but the fact is if you knew you were doing business with a company and then that company is somehow traced back to one of the drug cartels, you could be deemed to have been assisting a foreign terrorist organization. And that creates liability for the company as well. So what occurs here is that companies may be doing business with a company. They have a factory, they have janitorial service, they hire the janitorial service, and also the janitorial service is owned by the wife of one of the drug cartels who has been designated. And therefore, you may be materially assisting a foreign terrorist organization through your janitorial service, because they all have the illicit business, but then they have the legal businesses to launder their ill-gotten gains. So it is a very huge risk in different countries. Mexico is the brunt of it right now. I don't think it's going to be limited to Mexico. I think this tool is going to be used throughout the hemisphere for anybody engaged in the drug trade, but also I could see it expanding to other criminal organizations throughout the hemisphere. So companies in those countries, American companies in those countries, all have to be very careful that they have very significant compliance programs in place that help them be able to demonstrate that they haven't knowingly engaged in a transaction with a foreign terrorist organization.
That could be challenging, right? For the reasons you said. So for these American companies that are in some of these jurisdictions where there's a higher risk of there being, let's say, one of these cartels is an investor or a partial owner or whatnot, finding that out, it can be tremendously burdensome because it's not as if the person who's signing identifies himself as the leader of a particular cartel, as you well said. Not to get too specific, but when we talk about compliance programs, what is the reasonable expectation of what these compliance programs would need to look like to mitigate the risk that there could be an enforcement action against a company? Obviously, they need to show they took reasonable steps. Can you cite maybe some of the items that when you sit with clients and you tell them, listen, you need to implement these type of specific actions so that if this were to ever surface, you can show good faith that you really didn't know? I mean, what type of things are you advising clients?
Well, I think it's not very different than, as you said, FCPA compliance and anti-money laundering compliance. There is a significant amount of due diligence that you have to engage in. There's also an obligation to engage in periodic, reasonable risk assessments. What you can't do is say, I have a policy, I've created a policy, we're not going to be doing things with bad actors, and then nothing happens. The biggest way to get a company in trouble for knowingly engaging in a transaction is that they may not have known, but knowingly also means, did you turn a blind eye to it? And you just never looked to see whether or not your counterparty was someone that you should be concerned with. So every industry will be different. Everybody will have to have their own approaches. But I would say if you were going to talk about the two biggest elements is you really need to know who you're doing business with at a significant level, be able to show that you actually looked into it, didn't turn a blind eye to it, and you have to be conducting continual risk assessment. A risk assessment is good today, but 6 months from now, it may not be good. So you have to have continually updates. It is a burden. It is a cost. But you mentioned it. There is civil enforcement against companies that the U.S. Treasury does through the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, which is the sanctions police. But the Department of Justice has criminal prosecution capabilities. And talk about administrations. Lisa Monaco, the Deputy Attorney General under the Biden administration, she's famously quoted as saying, sanctions is the new FCPA. And I think that that's the signal. And they've created this entire fraud task force where they're going to start looking at who they target. And the targets of those prosecutions are going to be American companies, but they're also going to be non-American companies who are engaged in providing any kind of material assistance to a foreign terrorist organization. And in the absolute worst case scenario, which is like the worst thing that can happen to a company, you've engaged in all of these things, and then you become the target of U.S. sanctions at the same time.
Time just flies when we have these conversations. So before I ask you to pull out your crystal ball and talk about looking ahead, what will matter most, one thing I know many clients, friends around the world, whether it's Asia, Latin America, in this world where geopolitics is that much more, and the tariffs and the sanctions and whatnot. So many of them ask, okay, so I want an opportunity for you to give them some practical advice. They ask, what can I do about this in terms of engaging in DC? What works? What doesn't? Some people are wondering, what can I do? What would be the best thing I can do to help my business at the DC level? So if you could share some thoughts on what actually can be helpful, what really doesn't work, I think that would be very helpful to our clients globally.
Yeah, so I am always surprised by how reluctant non-American companies might be to engage in Washington, D.C. And I've seen this from across the globe. It's not just Latin America. It is from countries in Asia. It is from countries in Europe. But if you start to look at the more sophisticated companies, you start to see that they've finally gotten it, that they need to engage. They need to have a voice. They need to explain who they are. Many companies have very significant business links to the United States. I'll pick one out of the hat, and not something that I'm saying that we were involved in, but something that's in the newspapers. If you were in the Brazilian orange juice business, right? The bulk of our orange juice in the United States comes from Brazil. Well, if you were having a trade war between the United States and Brazil, are you going to sit back and let the government sort this out? Or do you engage yourself and make sure that your voice is being heard and that your partners' voices are being heard in the United States on this issue? And I think that those companies did engage in a very significant way to their benefit by being exempted from these tariffs. But that goes for everyone in the region. They all have significant ties here. You could decide how to calibrate it, but what shouldn't happen is to all of a sudden figure out I'm in a crisis and now I need to engage, because now you're in reactive mode rather than proactive mode. And having a proactive effort designed to enhance your standing is, in my view, the best way to go, because you develop alliances, you become a significant player in the development of policy. And some people say, well, why should I care about that? And I said, it matters because most of the time, all I have to do is pull up their global competitors, and I'll pull up their lobbying registrations, and I'll say, look at what your competitor from Korea is doing. Look at what your competitor from Sweden is doing. Look at what your competitor from Africa is doing. And all of a sudden they're like, and you're not doing anything. So it goes back to the old adage in Washington that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. That's what we're talking about here. So having a proactive strategy, it could be extensive, it could be small, it just depends, is important. Develop alliances, develop political champions, and then be ready in case something happens to be in a better position to react. So that's what I would urge. I think that we have seen in Latin America and Canada and elsewhere a much stronger desire to engage now than before. But I don't think this is going to go away. I don't think this is something that is just Trump administration driven. I think this is now just a way of having to do business in the new global economy.
So in closing, and I'm not going to ask you to predict the future, and I know that amidst all of the noise, the complexity, the cacophony of everything that's going on, I've heard you be, however, very optimistic about opportunities that may arise if you're nimble enough. So in closing, anything you want to share about how you see the road ahead, let's say, over the next, again, who knows, tomorrow's some geopolitical event, a war could break out in a certain jurisdiction and all of this is turned on its head. But in closing, what are your thoughts about the positioning for our clients or friends and opportunities in, let's just say, the next year?
Yeah.
Let's not talk about the next 10 years.
Yeah, well, I think we're just seeing the beginning of the overlay of national security concerns on global trade and investment. The U.S. is now also imposing restrictions on outbound investors, so private equity, venture capital firms are now having to consider what they're actually doing outside of U.S. borders. So the first thing I would say is that that is something that you're just going to see continuing to develop. I think that the situation between the United States and China will also be a big driver of this. It's not the only driver. Russia is a significant driver of things. Venezuela could be a particularly big driver of this. Just think of it from the perspective, if you're in the energy business in Latin America and something were to happen in Venezuela where not only do we go to massive sanctions or we actually have a kinetic engagement with Venezuela and the regime changes there, how does that change the energy sector globally? These are the kinds of things that I'm talking about. So from a U.S.-China perspective, a particular industry perspective, be thinking ahead of what are the likely things that are happening. I think that companies are not used to this approach. They are reluctant to do it. They're more engaged in looking at a return on investment at any given moment, but not necessarily thinking further. I think CEOs are starting to be in that role. And I think that boards in particular are starting to exercise that. We're seeing much more proactive engagement, particularly public boards, where they're saying, what is our geopolitical risk strategy? Do we have the right teams in place? Do we have outside consultants in place? Do we have the lawyers in place who are providing the advice? Or are we in a closed loop internally where we're just talking to ourselves and we're not seeing the broader and bigger picture? I think those are the kinds of things that people managing businesses that cross borders have to now engage in, and are going to be engaged in it not just the next year, as you said, but it's going to be for the near, middle, and probably long-term future.
Well, with that, we'll bring this session to an end. Ignacio, Iggy, thank you very much for sharing your insight. Tremendously valuable. I know our friends, viewers, listeners surely enjoyed it. So thank you very much, Ignacio. And to our friends who watch and listen, we appreciate your tuning in throughout the year. We look forward to our continued conversation with podcasts that we'll do in the new year, the Panoramic Podcast. In the meantime, wishing everyone felices fiestas, happy holidays, and may you start 2026 with the wind at your back. So thank you very much, Ignacio. Thank you very much to all our friends who joined us today.
My pleasure.
Thank you for joining us and listening to DLA Piper's U.S. Latin America Panorama Podcast. Please be sure to visit and follow us on LinkedIn under DLA Piper in Latin America and via dlapiper.com. If you have topics or speakers you'd like to suggest, please reach out to us at dlapiper.americas@dlapiper.com. Thank you for your interest. All information, content, and materials contained in this podcast are for general informational purposes only. This podcast is intended to be a general overview of the subjects discussed and does not create a lawyer-client relationship. Statements and opinions are those of the individual speakers and participants and do not necessarily reflect the policies or opinions of DLA Piper LLP US. The information contained in this podcast is not and should not be used as a substitute for legal advice. No listener should act or refrain from acting with respect to any particular legal matter on the basis of this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel in the relevant jurisdiction. This podcast may qualify as lawyer advertising, requiring notice in some jurisdictions. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. DLA Piper LLP US accepts no responsibility for any actions taken or not taken as a result of this podcast.